You're listening to The Art of Procurement, episode 118.
Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hi there, and thank you for hitting that play button to hear today's episode of The Art of Procurement. And my guest on the show today is Mark Webb. Mark is the Managing Director of UK-based procurement consultancy firm Future Purchasing. And following experience as a practitioner and then in consulting with both PwC and the QP Group, Mark co-founded Future Purchasing, and they've grown really from strength to strength since their inception, all the way back now in 2002. So Future Purchasing offers a range of procurement consulting services. They cover transformation, category management, SRM, cost reductions, and training and development. And it's with regards to category management that I actually connected with Mark and invited him onto the show. So as you may or may not be aware, Future Purchasing undertakes what I really think is the leading piece of research on the subject of category management within the procurement industry. And they just put the final touches on their 2017 Global Category Management Leadership Report, which is a research collaboration with Henley Business School in the UK. The full report weighs in at a pretty hefty 83 pages. There's a ton of insight contained within it. What I wanted to do in our conversation with Mark is to pick apart some of the key findings and understand what differentiates the leaders from the followers in terms of their approach to category management and then the results that they enjoy as a result of that. Okay, so without further ado, let's go straight into our conversation. So hi there everybody, and as I mentioned in my introduction, I'm thrilled to welcome Mark Webb, the Managing Director of Future Purchasing, to the show today. So Mark, welcome.
Thanks very much, nice to be here.
No, I'm delighted you can join me, and the focus of today's discussion, I think, is going to be to hear about the findings from Future Purchasing's 2017 Category Management Leadership Survey. And I know that it's been at least a 6-month journey for you. I recall, I think it was back in the summer, seeing calls for folks to come and participate in the survey. So I consider it to be a really important piece of actionable insight for anyone in the procurement community. And I do have a bunch of questions on the report and findings. But before I go there, I have a question that I want to start asking all of my guests in 2017 just to get a little bit more of an understanding of kind of what makes you tick. And so the question is, what are you passionate about right now in terms of some of the challenges or opportunities that we face as a procurement community?
Well, yeah, thanks, Phil, for that. The piece for us as an organisation and a team of people is that we see category management is often treated as it's more of a functional, siloed process. And what we really want it to be is a business process. And we get lots of requests from CPOs and leadership team members that are really all focused around trying to break out from this mentality of it's just procurement doing things on its own to how do we really work closely with business partners and get to a place where we can unlock all the value from spend just by being much closer to people and working all of the different opportunities that are available within a category. So that's it for us.
And have you got some, there's examples of companies who've been able to do that, to kind of transcend the notion of this being a procurement approach and moving into a business approach, and maybe one or two pointers of how they've been able to do it?
Yeah, I think it is challenging, and we'd always say it probably starts at the top, really, of the organisation and selling a concept, because you can make some changes within procurement and you can do certain things which are within your gift. You can give people competency frameworks around the right type of things, and you could start to plan people's learning by doing activities. But and all those things are great and they add value. But the really difficult questions are the ones that I think many people do tend to gloss over. So, if we gave some senior executives a list of options for things they would want to do, like giving stakeholders accountability for category management targets, or giving giving them some much more say in prioritization of projects. It's giving that list of things that are much more challenging. I think that's the type of organizational change we see, where people are going, you know what, I can do so much within procurement, but I really need the rest of the organization to work with us to get the full value that's available. And that's where we see the leaders really moving towards, is taking that challenge and being perhaps a bit more provocative around what it's going to take to get this. Because we have had clients and people that we know given big challenges, but they're not given the enablers to get there.
And do you see category management as something that ultimately, looks at being a broker of innovation as opposed to just being an optimizer of, current needs of the business?
Absolutely. I mean, in many organizations, category management is just a crude tool for aggregation of spend and using competitive tension and leverage. There's so much more that you can do. And I definitely see this as a trend in the future, is people really looking at the value that gets created, the innovations and the improvements, and seeing that. And most people have got something like that at some point with any category strategy. But we see that with clients as being, that's the heart of it. That is the beating heart. It's opportunities. It's doing things differently. It's doing things around risk as well as revenue generation, not just price down, which is obviously where most people recognise that has no longer got a shelf life, that type of approach.
So what I want to do, I could probably ask some more questions there, but I might be repeating myself as we go into talking about the survey. So let's talk about the category management leadership survey. And first of all, I wonder if you could just share maybe the inspiration behind it and how it's grown over time to what it is today and this year.
Sure. Well, I mean, it started out when we started 14 years ago working with clients on category management, and we could see that they were struggling really to implement it. So we built a diagnostic tool, which was 100 factors or so, but things to consider when you're implementing category management. It's not prescriptive, but it was the idea of pulling together the sort of experience that we'd had and the best practices we'd seen clients do. And we wanted to go a step further from that and really get some empirical evidence to say, well, actually, this isn't just us saying it, because, of course, we would say that type of thing. Here's some evidence from real organizations, and they are doing these things. And we can say that the leaders are doing certain things, therefore, it's worthy of consideration. So that was really the inspiration of it, taking a diagnostic tool and using, in the first instance, a lot of those questions and turning them into a survey so we could test our theory.
Make it a little bit more scientific.
Exactly, because there's nothing worse than people trotting up and then selling you some concepts, but there really isn't any depth to it. So we felt it gave it, and also you would expect category management is top 3 priority for over 70% of organisations in this survey, and there's no real structured approach to how people do it. There is no standard that you would expect somebody to be doing it by. It's about what each organisation has evolved their approach to. So if we can bring more standardization and identify the best practices and share it, that's got to be a good thing.
Yeah, so at least there's a framework, not necessarily being overly prescriptive, because I think that sometimes gets us in trouble of being seen as transactional, but at least having a framework so that folks know the best, like you say, some of the best practices so they can tailor those for whatever their specific requirements are.
Exactly, it's options for people to consider, and there's some proof behind it. So they may not fit the organisation absolutely, but at least there's almost a checklist to develop an approach from and build on as well.
So in the report, you talked about the notion of a leader versus a follower, and I have some questions, later to kind of look at the differentiators between the two. But I just wondered if you could share the thinking between what a leader is, what a follower is.
Yeah, there's. In the survey, we got people to self-categorize as one of 5 different options, one of which was, haven't really started on category management, through to at the other end of the scale, it's that we've optimized our approach, or we feel like we've optimized it. And by having them do that, we obviously came up with some definitions, and one of those areas that we put within that framework was, how close are you involved with stakeholders, how involved are they in category management, what's the amount of time that you spend as a team on category strategy work versus RFP negotiation type work, and trying to basically pull out, the difference. And it's really, for us, and it's a common theme in the report, it's about, time spent creating something which is an innovative strategy and is practical, and working much more closely hand in hand with stakeholders to do that. And that's what you can see when you look at those definitions.
Right. And what percentage do you recall, would self-select themselves as a leader? Is it top 5, top 10%, something like that?
With the leaders, we group together 2 categories, the top 2 categories, and call them the leaders, and they're 28% in this survey, and 72% are the followers, and that's broadly consistent with what we found in the previous survey. Of the people that would put themselves right out there and say, we've optimized this, we're doing as good a job as we think we possibly can do, that was 5%, and again, that is exactly what we found before. We do see, and in practical experience of talking with people and working with clients, even some of the biggest organisations in the world, there's loads more that they feel they can do.
Right. And what would be interesting to see is the correlation between the self-scored position, whether that's consistent with actually how they answered some of the questions in the survey, and whether there was sometimes a little bit of a juxtaposition between what they thought of themselves and what they were actually doing.
And there was in certain cases. In certain cases,
right?
But the guilty will remain nameless.
Absolutely. So, I looked at the structure of the report. I was interested to just understand the thinking behind pulling it into 5 different categories. You had a build, learn, lead, apply, deliver. Does that talk to a methodology, or are those just the kind of key areas that you found to almost bucket some of the findings that you had?
Yeah, it's bucketing the questions really, and what sits behind it is practices that people use. So the build one is obviously physical design, the process steps, guides, templates, and also does it connect into business processes and business objectives? Can you make a clear link between those things? Yeah. Learn, well, it's obviously educational aspects, and critically about stakeholder education, and that's often missed out of programs. The lead is about governance and operating models that people use, and actually getting some commitment from the business again to get involved in the creation of category strategies and reviewing category strategy and being involved in the governance process. Apply is very much about running a program and the practicalities of that, and then deliver is obviously the end results, be it the quality of category strategies, the savings, and the other value delivery that comes out of category management.
So let's go right into the results then. So what are some of the key findings that came out of the report to you?
Obviously we talked about the fact that 28% of organisations would categorise themselves as leaders and 72% as followers. But also, I think one of the interesting things, and we've worked the last 2 versions of the survey, this is the 3rd we've done, but the last 2 we've worked with Professor Mark Webb from Henley. And what he's done this time is create a model that links category management practices on one end to business outcomes at the other, and make a connection that we're going to test more, I've got to be honest, and Mark wants to get some more input from other leading organisations. But we want to make sure that the connection that he's proven so far is valid. But the idea is we've got 19 top practices that really he can prove have an impact on overall business performance. And as a midway point in that model is also the category management performance measures that we've identified. And we can see there's a clear connection. Those top 19 drive 68% of category management performance by the measures that we've identified, things like excellent category strategies, and does the process identify breakthrough opportunities. And that leads through to 15% of company performance. And again, having somebody from an academic background, he selected a number of questions in the survey, which helped us be very clear that they are valid questions to ask to assess company performance.
Right. So you mentioned there were 19 different recommendations for organizations that want to really successfully embed category management based on the findings. And, I'm interested in kind of looping back to some of the specific findings, but let's talk recommendations for a minute. And are there some that really jumped out that you wanted to share with listeners that you think are perhaps the most critical recommendations, or some that are foundational. You have to do certain things before you can even think about becoming on the journey to becoming a leader.
Yeah, I think there are some of the recommendations which are no-brainers and pretty much within the gift of procurement to go and do. So things like on-the-job learning experience. We keep seeing this with clients more and more, that recognition that classroom training isn't enough, and obviously learning doesn't stick. It's really this is a whole theory around 70-20-10 that many people will be aware of. But the on-the-job learning experiences, planning those, that's entirely within the gift of the procurement team. It requires some organisation, and you need to know the pipeline of projects, and you need to know the competency gaps. That is for me, that's a top one to consider on a learning program. And it goes away from this idea that, we're going to make all of our learning in a classroom with case studies and artificial setups. It's about, the evidence is out there. It's about doing it on the job, but being focused about it and giving people practical exercises and work to do that helps them build particular skills, and being a bit more formal about it. So I think that is one of those ones that I see very much within the gift of procurement. Also, things like organising your own methodology so that you can clearly demonstrate it links to the organisation's strategic objectives and it relates to the business processes. Someone I know in an oil company, he very much took the lead and reorientated their approach, looking at the engineering process and really pulled apart the category management process and sat it off the back of the business's engineering process, something that it recognised, something that it worked with. And you've got to really say that's it's not an obvious thing to do if you're coming from an environment very procurement orientated. But if you want to get buy-in and support using those type of businesses processes to structure your own approach, I think it makes a heck of a lot of sense, and they had a lot of success with that.
Yeah.
So I think.
Sorry, Mark, I was going to say that takes it away from being a silo that you mentioned at the beginning.
Absolutely. Anything you can do to make it, and even using, one of the things we've talked to clients about is using this sort of checklist to actually go through the ones that are more difficult, which are the stakeholder ones. That's the other side of the coin. One side is what's within procurement's gift and what can we achieve ourselves. So even things like balancing the resources across the categories. That's one of the top 19 recommendations. Entirely within procurement to structure itself, and often there are pressures from outside, but it's mainly procurement's gift. The other side of the coin, though, is the practices that really relate to stakeholders, and that's where there's going to be some more thought required in how some of those concepts are sold to people. And as we said at the start, this is about selling it at the top internally and not trying to drive something bottom up. So the idea of creating annual plans with stakeholders of category projects or supplier projects, both are relevant, and getting those agreed and getting buy-in to that and creating some form of upfront process. We call it category group planning because it's done at the category group rather than category level. But that formalization of that we see as something which it's pretty obvious. Some people call it an opportunity analysis, but it's trying to formalize it more and tie it into the cycle of business planning so that procurement's planning activity with the stakeholders ties into their budgeting cycle and business planning. And it has some teeth in it and has some evidence around what they've achieved in the past.
There was something that, and I don't know the exact percentage, I recall it when I was looking through the report, doing my research for our conversation, and it was something that just surprised me. And it was around only 50% of stakeholders are actually involved in the development of category plans. So, that means that 50% of the time we're doing it on our own and it's completely in isolation, and then just hoping to convince the business that, what our strategy is the right strategy, rather than actually building a strategy around what the business needs, what the business wants.
Absolutely. It's old school approach of, build it and then sell it to somebody and spend all your time trying to convince people, as opposed to getting them on side early on, involving them right in the detail of it. Because ultimately, the value levers that exist, many of them are controlled by the business stakeholders. So things around demand management, specification. If we want to get into that, which really opens up big opportunities, then we need full support and we need those people involved.
Yeah.
One of the other recommendations and the findings of that in the report is about the time that we get, and both time from stakeholders and time from the procurement team to do this work is less than it should be in order to optimize it. And that's one of the things that we see a number of clients working through at the moment in terms of their operating model, separating out activities into either front, middle and back office, or some people have called it strategic, and I don't know quite what they call the other word, but it has to be done somewhere. But getting the time to do this is really, really key. And that means, from the stakeholder perspective, you've got to get support and buy-in, and it has to be the type of work that they want you to be doing and for them to be contributing resources to.
Yeah, and you have to quickly demonstrate to the stakeholders that you can bring value when you're having these conversations to them. And then also, I guess, their time, we don't have much of an impact on the availability of their time that they can dedicate to something like category management over and above one being more efficient in what we do and the conversations we have with them, but also it's kind of needs the epiphany on their side that this is worth them investing their own time in.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So this is a bit of a journey, and there needs to be proof of concept, there needs to be trust, and there needs to be, the kind of value demonstrated from the procurement team that they couldn't do themselves ultimately. And showing people, even sometimes it's so basic as showing people the spend across the organisation in certain category areas that people have never seen before, and they don't, they've never seen the totality of what goes on. And when confronted with evidence, often people will do the logical thing, and it's not about one size fits all. It's about taking that spend and doing the appropriate things for the appropriate parts of the organisation, but actually just knowing what you're doing and aggregating where it makes sense. And try and drive value for all parts of the organisation.
So are there a couple of other ones that you want to pull out that listeners should take away from those recommendations?
Yeah, I think the couple that I would say these are the more thorny topics, but the ones to aspire towards is really stakeholders having formal objectives for category management, and there's joint accountability. Both of those two cropped up in the survey, but formal objectives, overall 20% of respondents had those, and joint accountability was 31%. So it's relatively low, but there is scope there, and that's really when you see organisations with their back against the wall, they do a lot more of more radical things, and they really drive change. And this is a way, I think, of without those business contexts having to be as grim as they often are when this starts happening. But I think these can be introduced as concepts, almost like if you want to get to the level of savings that we've seen in the report, and again, we know from the findings that the leaders generate better savings rates from category projects, which is just over 11% versus 7.7%. But also they have more coverage across category strategies. So they have 64% of spend covered by category strategy. Followers have 34%. Combine those two things together in the model that we put into the report, and you can see that if you took $1 million of spend, the leaders are getting sometimes like 3 times the benefit delivery than followers, which is what you would expect if you took an AEP survey or something from McKinsey. They demonstrate similar type of numbers, and we can see these practices because of the linkage and the model Mark created. Doing these practices helps people move from follower to leader, and that hopefully gets them to the better level of savings and other value delivery in risk and revenue generation areas.
Yeah, I feel that having formal objectives with stakeholders, maybe it's easier when the objectives on both sides are cost-based because that's how we're measured. But when you start to look at some of the other objectives that a stakeholder may have, maybe we're not mature enough yet to be able to change how we measure our category managers, for example, around whatever the benefits are that the stakeholder needs that are not cost-based. It's whatever they need to do their job. And you talked about the fact that it's companies often that are in a lot of difficulties that are able to do this, and I'm guessing that's because they can mandate a joint cost objective, but it gets a little bit more difficult when it's around, business outcomes.
Yeah, no, I think I definitely agree with you. It is, we know a big electronics organisation in Europe, and they were demonstrating at a conference we attended about the program, which was doing all of these sort of things because they had to, because the business needed the cash. Yeah. And that's all, it's an option, but it's about, in some cases, it's selling that option early on before these things happen and being a bit more perhaps demanding of the business to say, are you sure you don't want this because this is the size of the prize? So it is definitely a business context. The other point you mentioned, though, I think is really important, is about value and what do we measure, what are we trying to achieve? And I think if people use some form of value definitions that go beyond price and cost into risk and revenue generation, it just, I wouldn't say it blows the minds of stakeholders, but it certainly makes them take a step back and go, you're thinking about these things because we thought you were only down there in that bottom corner thinking about price and cost. And having objectives for category projects that are demonstrably around risk and revenue and innovation, I think that's where the function needs to get to. It's common sense. We can't just be doing it around cost savings. And there are some organisations where they've made the function and given them targets around those two areas also.
Yeah, and it changes the conversation. I think when that you're having with a stakeholder, when you're actually talking to them about how can I help you be better at what you need to achieve, rather than how can you help me achieve a cost saving goal, when that's not what their objective is. And so then they only bring us in when either yes they do need to save money, or B they need a contract written and they've already figured everything else out.
Yeah, and that's where we think the category group planning type of approach, which sits above category management, of creating a formal approach to prioritising projects and then agreeing what the value objectives from those projects are. It's just a mature way of working, which means that it isn't just somebody picks up the phone and decides to involve procurement at the last minute, which is always going to happen to a certain extent. But it's just shifting the pendulum more towards we know what's going on. We're involved at an early stage. We can influence all of the value levers at an early stage, and we've got joint objectives around this. And it isn't just us being dragged by our one-off savings targets that are distorting the behaviours of the team, and then leads to lack of buy-in and support from the business.
So what are some of the biggest differentials between the leaders versus the followers? I know you briefly mentioned there the difference in cost savings and spend under management. Are there any others that really highlight the difference between whether you're implementing some of these recommendations or not?
Yeah, no, in terms of outputs and the performance measures we identified, we could see things like category strategies being excellent. Again, leaders outperform followers by 50%. Excellent. Category managers being excellent at applying the management process. Again, 100% above the follower standard the leaders have reached. Identifying breakthrough opportunities, following a similar profile, and also stakeholder support being demonstrably twice as good in a leader as it is a follower. But there are some of the practices where there's big gaps between the leaders and the followers. Competency assessment focused on the skills required for category management. That's a 42% gap between the leaders and the followers. That's much more than 100% in that case. And also in the area of making activities mandatory. And that's not about, certainly in the way we interpret it, that's not about everything gets done in the same way. This is about saying there's a bare minimum we expect, and that's about modulating the category management process such that simple categories get, a proportion of category management tools applied. Yeah. The complex, high-value categories, get a more substantial proportion of those used, and then you're defining by those different categories or categorization of the spend. You're saying actually, well, there's a bigger proportion of tools that get applied at the more complex end, and it's about making those definitions the bare minimum for those levels mandatory.
So at least there's a framework. Again, kind of goes back to saying about frameworks before, but there's a framework there that then flexes based on the individual category.
Yeah, if I've got an $80 million category that's touching all parts of the business and this degree of complexity in it, and I know it's, we're looking across a number of geographies, number of business units, I'm going to take a much more structured approach. But you can't have then somebody, applying a bare minimum sort of, I've done the business requirements, I know the supply market, I'm going out to tender. That's not category management.
Right.
And that's totally appropriate if it's $500,000 in a, we're talking about a multi-billion-dollar organization here. But it's about horses for courses and being much more certain about what is the minimum expectation.
And knowing the materiality, so it's not just a spend, but it's how important strategically is that category to the future of the business, or even the current operations of the business.
Absolutely, it's not. It isn't just about spend is a kind of rough estimate and gets us in the right sort of book. But there are always categories and suppliers that are always on the other side of the line for good reason, because they're going to, the spend's going to grow, or the strategic impact is such that it's worth spending time on it.
Yeah. So was there anything that surprised you? Especially given the context of this is the third time you've run the report, and maybe there's areas where you would expect to see a maturity and there wasn't, or there were numbers that were maybe outliers versus what was reported the last time through, or was it in line with what you expected, frankly?
It kind of was in line, but even the leaders around things like sufficient time from the category managers for category management activity, 41% for leaders and 38% for followers. That was the closest gap. That surprised me. I think the next time we run the survey, that gap will be bigger, and I think the followers will have implemented and had time to bed in some of the work they're doing around operating models and freeing up category manager time. Because it isn't just about having great processes and tools, it's about having the time to apply it and having the orientation. And they're bringing in new people who are much more business orientated than just the traditional procurement silo mentality. So I think that one will definitely, I would expect that one to shoot up. Overall, I would say it is in line with our expectation and with the trends. There's a couple of drop-offs for the leaders. I can't remember quite which measures there are, but there are a couple that have perhaps backed off a little bit. But generally, followers stable, leaders improving in a few areas, dropping back in a few areas.
Mm-hmm. You just mentioned something about that I've heard, consistently. So to me, it seems like it's much more of a trend than it is just a few isolated cases. But the fact that organizations are bringing in business leaders or people with business knowledge to be category managers and kind of teaching the category management and the procurement to them rather than vice versa. Is that something that you see as well in your world? Recruit attitude and train skills. It's all around that, and we are definitely seeing this the idea that if I need to go and recruit somebody from outside of procurement, even outside of the business, outside of procurement, I'm willing to do it if I'm going to get that spark of creativity and the challenge to the status quo and the ability to work with people and interact with people and be much more, perhaps in some ways, confident about your reason for being there as a procurement professional. By the way, one other point should worth pointing out from the survey is the cycle time of category strategy creation and implementation. That's down substantially for leaders, 24%, down from 34 weeks to 26. So that was quite a surprise. And it's a good thing, because I think in many organisations, it just takes too long to do this. Yeah. And we do wonder whether or not, if we started with a constrained time period, and if said you get 4 weeks, and if you still need more time, you get 8 weeks, and if you still need more time, you get 60. What would be the quality difference if we put that and used it as a metric, which I don't think, frankly, most organisations think about? It just takes too long, and there's certainly stakeholders think about it, and CFOs think about it, because that elapsed time is in-year savings, frittering away. So it's good to see that leaders have made some great progress in that area, and in the next couple of years, as before the next survey, we'll be looking at some of the reasons for that and delving a little bit closer into the practices they're using to achieve that kind of outcome. And I'm not sure if you asked a question on this, but it just came to mind. There was, when you look at a category strategy, you can either you do it as a one-time event and 9 months or 10 months down the line, you go and refresh it, and it's good to go for the next year. And that's what a lot of organizations seem to do. And on the other hand, it's a living, breathing document that changes every day as information is known to you changes. Do you see a difference? And again, you may not have asked this in the survey, but you probably see it in your day-to-day work between a leader and a follower in how they approach kind of the constant refresh of category strategies.
Yeah, it's a good point. And the leaders, these tools and templates and ways of working, it doesn't matter whether people are using the templates, they're thinking, they're doing it all the time and they're using it all the time. They're dipping into it, updating it. And I think there's a probably a middle group that they're using a category management approach, but it's something that's dragged out of a cupboard every 3 years,
right?
And it isn't living and breathing. And it's also a massive mountain to climb every 3 years. And I think that's why one of the barriers to progress is that people don't update it on an ongoing basis, don't engage with people in the business around the strategy and updating it and refreshing it. So if they did that much more, I think the whole, this feeling that we used to do, which we hear from a lot of clients, we did this in the past, tried it, but they didn't stick at it, and they reverted back to perhaps a more traditional RFP and negotiation orientation. I think keeping it live, keeping it fresh, but that's the management team in the procurement function and also the stakeholders. They've got to want to see this stuff, and they've got to want to see have access. And this is one of the things that technology is obviously going to change. But it's that access to information and knowledge management, which, frankly, most organisations procurement teams have been fairly weak at, is having central repositories, having up-to-date information that anybody can access. That's changing rapidly, and I think we'll see a massive difference in 2 years around that question.
Right. So as we start to wrap up, and first of all, just thank you so much for sharing, some of your findings. I know that it's such an in-depth report, and I think that it's unusual to really have the level of detail and thought and methodology that goes into the outcomes and the findings that you have. So this is based on a lot of research. So we could have gone in lots of different ways, and we could have probably done a 3-hour show doing it. So, it was more around getting a flavor for some of those findings. What I did want to know, and kind of as a last question for our conversation is, is there something that you want listeners to take away from the survey with regards to, the effectiveness or the benefits of category management? What's kind of the one thing? What should they take away and action or implement or think about today?
Yeah, I think, for me, this it's probably misused quote now, but this is the end of the beginning, not the beginning of the end, to misuse that phrase. But category management isn't. Some people would say, well, we've moved on, we've already done that. No, you haven't. There's lots more that can be done in most organisations. It's some difficult stuff, some difficult decisions, but there is so much more value that's available, as we can show through the findings of the survey, both quantitatively in terms of savings and other value. So, it's about orientating the business around category management, not just the procurement function. Yeah. And I think so few people have done that. This is, there'll be new technologies, new ways of doing it, new ways of looking at things. But however you used a very broad definition of category management at the start around innovation and finding value, that's what it is to me, and that will never go away because 50%, 60%, 80% of your revenue going out of the back door into supplier spend. How can you not keep focusing on new ways to find value from that? And that's what it's all about.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. I feel that things like category management, if people say that, well, we've done category management, that's because you're saying you've done it, and this is my opinion, within the boundaries of what traditional procurement may have been. And traditional procurement was about thinking around how do I optimize what the business needs. And so, maybe you've gone through a process which helps to reduce costs and you've taken out low-hanging fruit. And so you're at a point where there isn't a great opportunity to show, 10, 20, 30% savings through putting a process like this in place. But this is about far more than just trying to save money. It's about how are we relevant and bringing things from the outside into our organization and being kind of the leaders of disruption, the leaders of innovation, and introducing our stakeholders to concepts that's out there in supply markets they might not know about themselves. And if you think about it in that way, to me, you talked about value. There's so much more we can bring from processes like this and from strategies that we can put in place on a category basis that far transcend what our traditional thinking is. And maybe that's my rant for the day, but that's kind of where I look at this and how I think about it.
It's exciting. The unfortunate thing is category management as a name, as a sort of brand that gets associated with procurement. it isn't probably the best thing. Management. We've toyed with the idea of leadership around this, and that's why it's used in the survey sort of naming. But I think it is about leadership. It's about procurement leading what to do with the external spend of the organisation.
Yeah. So if listeners would like to find out a little bit more, maybe if you have a summary of the report that you can share, or if they'd like to reach out to you, where should they find out more, or how can they contact you?
Yeah, the executive summary of the research is available on www.futurepurchasing.com. That's freely available to download. Yeah. If anybody would like the full report, please contact me directly at mwebb, 2b's, at futurepurchasing.com. And I'm happy to share what we've got and help people move forward with category management in their own organisation.
Great. Well, what I'll do, Mark, is I'll include those links as well at the show notes for today's episode. So those are going to be at artofprocurement.com/FP survey. That's artofprocurement.com/FP survey. And I'll include the, your email address and the link to the executive summary. So listeners can go and find out more. So, Mark, with all but that being said, I just want to thank you again so much for joining me on the Art of Procurement today, and for your time in sharing some of the findings from the report from the survey.
Thanks very much, Phil. I enjoyed it.
All right, thank you. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.